I'd just like to introduce Dr. Fabrice Fitch. Fabrice is a composer and music scholar who was born in France and raised between there and Canada. He's taught music at Durham University, the RNCM, and is currently a senior research fellow here at the RCS. He's also a wonderful mentor and friend, which I just thought I'd put in there. He's, as a composer, close collaborations with performers have been an essential component of his compositional outlook, which focuses on the acoustic properties of instruments and seeks out performance situations where they communicate most effectively to an audience, which explains why a lot of his output consists exclusively of works for solo instruments, duos, and small ensembles. The performance context that Fabrice envisages takes account of his works alongside the other pieces that have been programmed, which why tonight's talk about polyphony post-pandemic is something that I think will work extremely well. He's been introduced as the minimalist wing of new complexity, and his pigeonholes go. That's a description that he's happy to live with, and now it's on film on Zoom, he's going to have to. He also reviews extensively, most notably for Gramophone. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Fabrice Fitch.
Thank you very much, James. Good evening, everybody. Well, it was in February this year that the festival organizers of Las Polyphoniae in Antwerp, which takes place every summer, invited me to contribute some thoughts on the relevance of Renaissance polyphony to today's cultural environment, to coincide with the launch of my book, Renaissance Polyphony, at the festival itself in August. At the time, there was no suggestion, as back in February, no suggestion at all that the spread of COVID-19 might lead to the postponement of this year's program, let alone the disruption to lives and livelihoods it's visited on so many of us, in some cases, all too tragically. In any case, when I sat down to write at last, I had to rethink my initial ideas. It was simply impossible not to mention the elephant in the room. Never mind today's cultural environment, tomorrow's will surely bear the imprint of recent events, though it's far too early to guess how. Concurrently, at the start of lockdown, a number of colleagues at the RCS Research Knowledge Exchange Group collated their impressions in a blog to which I was asked to contribute. At that time, it seemed quite impossible for various reasons, but what follows is in part a response to their initiative. Reflecting on the impact of the pandemic on the cultural environment, it is likely that some of the more extreme predictions are wide of the mark. One cannot underestimate the tendency to revert to familiar behaviors, but I doubt that the performing arts will be afforded this luxury. For those of us involved in it, the strange liminal period, which seems set to drag on until it's no longer perceived as liminal, alas, this liminal period encourages us to reflect on the value of live performance and its place in society. On that score, it turns out Renaissance musicians may have had a few things to tell us, and not just because Renaissance society was very well acquainted with pandemics. Almost coincidentally, most of what follows echoes themes explored in my book, and it will quickly be obvious that although most of my examples relate directly to music, my observations on them apply equally to dance and to drama. The modern concert experience typically embodies a triangular hierarchical relationship with the composer on top, the performer and audience beneath, and the musical score as the currency of exchange between them. Not only is this situation peculiar to Western culture, within that culture it's also relatively new. The set of protocols and behaviors associated with what is sometimes called the concert ritual really became fixed only about the turn of the 20th century. That phrase with its sacred associations, that's the concert ritual, is significant. What is being celebrated? Well, the idea of high art itself, with the composer in the pantheon, the performers as celebrants, and the audience as a congregation of sorts. Although it's hardly surprising that the hierarchical relationship becomes so ritualized, given how often ritual expresses hierarchy, that development is not inevitable. In any case, its specificity to Western culture is now generally acknowledged. Another defining feature of the concert ritual is the division of labor, if I can call it that, between the function of creator, composer, performer, and audience. Each function is uniquely and entirely vested in one category of participant, with no crossover between them. Even within Western culture, this too is a recent phenomenon. Well into the 20th century, composers performed their own music or even improvised. During the second half of the 20th century, the institutionalization of the concert ritual has been challenged on several fronts. First, within music generally, through a greater awareness of the musical practice of other cultures. Second, within Western art music, through the practice of contemporary composition and music making. And finally, through the practice of other art forms, most obviously drama. A fourth category, pop music, brings other factors into play, notably economic ones, with which I'm not so concerned today. These challenges are best understood in terms of the triangle described above. With improvised music, for example, creator and performer are one and the same. And in some forms of experimental music, the function of performer and audience is vested in a single individual, as when a piece is said to be performed in an otherwise empty room, say. In this light, the Western concert ritual is revealed as a highly specialized case. Christopher Small's term musicking, which personally I find quite ugly, although I know why it's there. The term musicking, which has been widely adopted within scholarships, seeks to account for all the other forms of practice whilst integrating the concert ritual within a broad framework. Nowadays, the concert ritual applies to music that was never designed to be heard that way or experienced that way, not least the vast majority of Renaissance polyphony. That's not to say that there was no intersection at all during this period. In certain courtly environments, as we shall see, singers and instrumentalists did perform composed music for an attentive audience of connoisseurs. But such situations did not come with the same cultural baggage. However celebrated, the composer was emphatically not on top of the pyramid. The iconography of performing ensembles for sacred polyphony in the Renaissance typically emphasizes their physical proximity, which more resembles a group huddle than the prim formal deployment of their modern counterparts all in a row. And I'm going to be sharing a few pictures of these representations now. You'll see that they're constantly touching each other, often with hands on each other's shoulders. There's no social distancing there, probably as a means of keeping time. Sometimes a fold, as in this picture, in fact, a fold in their clerical robes at knee level denotes a tapping of the foot, very likely for the same reason, keeping time. These closely observed details recur often enough to suggest that they were commonplace and struck contemporary artists forcibly. The distinctiveness of these ensembles was not just audible, but visible. And yet, the singer's activity is not the main focus of attention. Shall we perhaps just show a few more? The burgundy one there. Yes, that's a good one. Yeah. This is a particularly famous one. This is Philip the Good, the Duke of Burgundy, hearing Mass with his chapel, about whom we know perhaps more than, well, most chapels that we know anything about. It's a very distinctive scene. Let's have another one. Let's show, can you scroll down? Is that, I don't know, is that a lot? Okay, oh, this one, yeah. Yes, I like this one. They look like thugs, really. You wouldn't want to meet them in a dark alley. Yes, that's good. This is from the Trérichard du Duc de Berry, so this is about 1400. And now one last one, maybe. Let's have Maximilian's Court. Let's do this one. Yeah, let's just skip straight to the large image. Okay, in this image you can see that the singers are on the right of the picture. but at the foreground, and the youngest of them, as you can see, are choir boys. This image is of Maximilian, Emperor Maximilian I, again hearing Mass. So more often than not, these pictures are not the main focus of attention. As you can see, they are just one component in a complex event, another ritual, in fact, which is the Catholic Mass. Just as the music they sang adorned the sacred text, their song itself was an adornment of the liturgy, along with the tapestries, reliquaries, chalices, vestments, altarpieces, illuminated Bibles, and prayer books, and so on. Even the singer's enunciation of the sacred text was inessential. That was the priest's job. That was the priest's job. And you see in most of the pictures I've shown you, the larger ones, there's a priest present. And as long as the priest said the right words in the right order, the Mass was valid. The corollary is that there was no audience in the modern sense. The congregation's attention was supposedly fixed on the ritual unfolding before it. And the music, often an ornamentation of plain chant, was meant to focus the attention. In reality, the power of music was acknowledged for its own sake. Throughout the Renaissance, one finds churchmen complaining of people going to Mass just to hear the music. Can just switch that. Okay. This has prompted modern scholars to ask, as in the title of an influential text by Bonnie J. Blackburn, for whom do the singers sing? The answers aren't mutually exclusive. To their princely or ecclesiastical patron, to the congregation, or to God. In his elaborate diaries recording the life of the papal court, a particularly well-documented institution, the papal master of ceremonies, Johann Burckhardt, writing at the turn of the 16th century, mentions the singers of the chapel, of whom he seems to have been none too fond. Describing a particular liturgical feast, he writes, here the singers sang one of their motets. The term motet in its broadest sense here meaning any kind of composed polyphony. It seems that the chief official responsible for the conduct of the papal liturgy didn't especially care what the singers sang. There is in fact considerable evidence that they were often left just to get on and choose their repertoire themselves. Not always the case, but it did happen. What is clear is that they regarded themselves as a highly specialized group with its own lingua franca, bearing in mind that singers of polyphony were considered separate from those who sang plain chant. Another suggested piece of evidence is from the principal source of Pierre de la Rue's motet Ave Sanctissima Maria, which is now in the Royal Library in Brussels, which includes a depiction of the Virgin on a crescent moon with the sun at her back, surrounded by angels. Bonnie Blackburn relates this iconography to a dispensation by Pope Sixtus IV, whom Burckhardt served. Sixtus IV died in 1484, and this dispensation by the Pope granted anyone who sang the prayer Ave Sanctissima Maria, which the motet says, anyone who sang that prayer while gazing at such a picture with the Virgin on the crescent moon had, wait for it, 11,000 years of remission from purgatory. Therefore, the indulgence applied to the singers every time they performed La Rue's motet from the choir book. So in a very real sense, the singers sang for themselves. That said, the precision with which Renaissance artists portrayed singers of polyphony, as you saw, betrays a fascination with their physical presence, their intense concentration, and sometimes fierce expressions, the sense of a compact unit focused as one on the act of performance. That impression would have been the greater when they improvised polyphony. So ingrained in modern perception is the primacy of the composer that this facet of polyphony has only recently come under sustained scrutiny. This was in no sense free improvisation. In common with most composed sacred polyphony until the late Renaissance, it was most often based on plain chant. Now, the rules for doing so were similar to those that obtain in composed polyphony, and the musical results could be just as varied, ranging from simple chordal elaboration harmonization of the chant, as we might say, to more contrapuntally complex ones. If that seems surprising, one must remember that these singers were thoroughly versed in the rules of counterpoint, which they internalized from a very young age. Nonetheless, such collective improvisation involved a high degree of proficiency and collective training, a sense of coordination, ensemble, spontaneity of invention, in a word, virtuosity. For all their contribution to the liturgy being peripheral in the strict sense, the spectacle of a vocal ensemble spontaneously extemporizing polyphony must have been fascinating. Nor was polyphonic improvisation the preserve of singers in the decades leading up to 1500. Instrumental ensembles were routinely paid to do so. Improvisation was also the stock in trade of soloists, whether instrumentalists, or poets, whose furious inspiration is a frequent topic of Renaissance observers. One of the most frequently cited cases is that of the lutenist Pietro Bono del Chitarrino, based at the ducal court of Ferrara in the mid-15th century. A report from 1456 portrays him as, quote, on fire, as though divinely inspired, cavorting, exulting, and unable to suppress his joy. And as he invents new forms of melody, his face bathed in sweat, the strings can no longer bear it. They snap in his excessive desire for praise, unquote. Another writer stresses the embodied nature of Pietro Bono's virtuosity. Quote, observe closely the digits of his left hand coursing along the chitarra, the hands that nimbly traverses the harmonious strings. You will be amazed at how his hand seems to be in several places at once, unquote. Even though Pietro Bono's improvisations must have included polyphonic ideas such as ricercares or fantasias, not a note of his music survives. Even in his lifetime, his reputation rested entirely on his powers as an improviser. What is an issue that goes beyond the absence of a musical text? In his fine study of improvisation in the Renaissance, of which I'm currently preparing a translation, Philippe Canguilhem considers the humanist Michele Verino's encounter with another improviser, not a musician this time, but a poet, Antonio di Guido. He says, quote, once I heard Antonio singing of the wars of Orlando so eloquently that one might have been hearing Petrarch in person or fancied oneself in the midst of battle rather than merely hearing a description of it. Later, I read one of his poems, which was so uncouth as to seem the work of another. And this is still a quote. Clearly, therefore, such works are best when delivered with eloquence, for this exercise benefits greatly from the diligent and judicious use not only of the voice, but of bodily gesture also, unquote. Thus, Renaissance writers recognized the accomplished performer's ability to transmute undistinguished material into an involving and immersive experience. This may be an extreme case, but Verino's conclusion, extrapolating as it does from the particular to the general, is as clear a statement of the principle as can be found anywhere. In such situations, it is in the human presence, the performer's aura, far more than in what is being played, that the successful performance is vested. My final example is the one that requires the least comment. The Concerto delle Dame was active in Ferrara more than a century after Pietro Bono. This female ensemble performed music written especially for it by composers associated, either directly or indirectly, with the ducal court. So influential were they that similarly constituted ensembles sprang up at other courts, and thus they can actually be credited with the rise of a new genre. Of all my examples, this one seems the most familiar to us, albeit with some significant twists. The gendering of roles replicates the situation of many a modern ensemble, whereby female musicians perform works by predominantly male composers. But both socially and artistically, the Concerto delle Dame were as renowned as the composers whose music they sang. Unsurprisingly, the gender excited much comment, not without some pejorative associations. Female court entertainers were commonly associated with courtesans, high-class sex workers. There is an intriguing counterpart, though, to the Concerto delle Dame from the same time and place. A stone's throw away from the ducal court, the nuns of the convent of San Vito were also celebrated for their music making. The key difference is not just one of repertory, much of the nuns' music was composed by the nuns themselves, or social position, but of embodiment. While the Concerto delle Dame were literally on display, hence the association with courtesans, the nuns were hidden from their audiences by a screen. They were disembodied voices, as the title of Craig Munson's study has it. Both ensembles are examined more recently in Laurie Strass's fine monograph. This difference notwithstanding, the notion of embodiment, flaunted in one case and withheld in the other, is key to both ensembles' reputations and doubtless their aura in actual performance. That's water, by the way. What light do these different situations shed on the relevance of live performance in the aftermath of the pandemic? As I hinted at the start, there are bound to be challenges, particularly as inevitable financial crises focus resources onto those areas deemed to be of the first urgency, to the detriment of those that supposedly are not. And we've been hearing plenty of that just in the last few days, some of it quite comically, in fact. Those of us with a stake in the performing arts had better have our arguments ready. Much is being made of the online forms of communication that have facilitated our social and professional interactions since lockdown began. Ironically, we had already begun to take these for granted, but just as we missed those daily human exchanges that we'd equally taken for granted, so these forms of mediated immediacy, so to speak, have seen more obtrusive presences from the moment that they became our sole mode of interaction with others. It is likely that online media will become even more normalized as a result of COVID-19, whether in the personal or professional spheres, but the greater the emphasis on virtual forms of communication, the stronger should be our advocacy of those forms whose fundamental predicate is direct human contact. The common thread running through all my case studies is the centrality of the performer. Even polyphony, which modern audiences primarily associate with musical works of composers, could perfectly well take place independently of either composer or work through collective improvisation, as we've seen. This was as true at the end of the Renaissance, by which time several factors, not least the commercial printing of polyphony, contributed to the growing perception of composers as authors. It's true not just at the end of the period, as in its early stages when works were most often transmitted without a composer's name attached in manuscript. The loosening of these two functions from the performance situation necessarily places the focus onto the singers. I referred earlier to the visual fascination they exerted on contemporary artists, which parallels the sense of embodiment mentioned in connection with the Concerto delle Dame, or Donne, as you like. In the flesh, that strong presence had to do not only with their physical appearance, but also the quality, the pitch, one might say, of their interactions, gestures, visual cues, shared breaths, general sense simultaneously of attentiveness to each other and intent alertness to their collective enterprise. It's difficult to find an English equivalent for that impression or word for it. The German word Stimmung is perhaps useful here. I would describe it as a state of locked-inness, an intensity that communicates in and of itself, whether or not the performers register the audience's presence and however they seek to involve them or not. It may seem paradoxical that a composer should toy with the redundancy of the composer function, though of course it's not unknown, hardly, but that's not what I'm doing. Far from marginalizing the composer, this quality of locked-inness is a very powerful compositional resource. I've had the good fortune to work with ensembles and soloists that possess it to a very high degree, as the examples of Pietro Bono and Antonio Di Guido show. Soloists can be equally communicative. And when this stage presence and interactions become part of compositional thinking in the broadest sense, how will the music feel to them to perform individually and collectively? How will they look as they perform it? How will the quality of their interactions communicate themselves to the audience? For me, this visual aspect is more is not usually dissociable. I'll start again. For me, this visual aspect is not usually dissociable from the experience of the music, but even though the latter should also work on its own terms, again, speaking personally for myself, I will spend a great deal of time imagining the piece as performed by these particular artists. And this aspect is constantly in my mind. My familiarity with the performance is further, with the performers is further reinforced by close preparatory collaboration, typically focusing on aspects of sound production, but also taking in a host of other impressions that often find their way into the score, or concretely into the piece. When some composers say that their music talks back at them, they may be referring to the experience of actual composition. But just as often, I suspect having the piece reflected back at them through the agency of the performer, which the composer controls or foresees only to a limited extent, is equally powerful. Because the details of a written musical text are intended in most cases to be reproducible, the musical score is a highly particularized performance medium. I once attended a student performance of Steve Reich drumming. After the musicians had entered one by one at the very beginning of the piece, the beat, which until then had been perfectly even, began to speed up almost imperceptibly until it seemed as though the ensemble must either stabilize or lose control. Just as they seemed about to break down, they reached a plateau and the tempo settled, and the piece continued for the rest of about 80 minutes or so. That accelerando is not in the score. It cannot possibly have been planned. But this seeming brush with disaster, was one of the most thrilling moments of live performance I've ever experienced. Yet, as my examples from the Renaissance testify, such seat of the pants situations can perfectly well occur in the absence of a score. We can only guess at what improvised polyphony at the French, Burgundian, or Spanish court chapels might have sounded like on a high feast day. But the vocal and contrapuntal pyrotechnics as the singers chased and jostled each other like musical bumper cars careering at high speed against the plain chant must have been thrilling to witness. Ultimately, the irreducible component of live music is not vested in a work, nor even in what is performed, but rather in the sum and the quality of human interactions that make up a performance. By no means is that meant to downplay the value of what is being performed, as I hope to have shown with reference to drumming. Since, apart from anything else, the myriad details of a performance are necessarily shaped by a score. Nor, needless to say, is it unwarranted to attend a performance for the sake of either the work or the performer or both. But since the complex interactions that inform a performance and their power to affect the observer are so often described in terms of what is performed rather than on their own terms, it seems reasonable to draw attention to that irreducibility. On that basis, live performance is not solely a form of entertainment, but a mode of close observation of human behavior to be enjoyed and also critically evaluated on its own terms. The fact that this observation is most often a communal experience further enhances its sociological pertinence in what is undoubtedly a socially unsettled and unsettling time. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Fabrice. That was absolutely fascinating. What we'll do now is allow Lois to come back onto screen a little bit. If people would like to start thinking of their own questions, building off anything that Lois says, then we'll start with Lois for 10 to 15 minutes or so, or until something excellent comes into the question and answers, and then we'll start pivoting to you. So do please start asking your questions, and we'll get to them and allow this to move quite naturally. So, Lois.
Thanks, James.
Here's the book.
Yeah, it really exists, finally. We've lived with that for a very long time.
Yeah, indeed.
So, despite the fact that we're married, we haven't pre-planned these questions. So as a consequence, some of them will touch on things Fabrice already talked about in the talk just there, and ask him to expand on them a little bit. But the first one I wanted to ask you is really just, how have you tried to make this book different in approach from others in the similar area? Because it's not the first book on the Renaissance.
Sure. Well, I've tried. There are many books that talk about the Renaissance in music. Many of them have the title "Music in the Renaissance." But what I've tried to do is move away from studies that situate the music in their cultural or their social contexts. Not that there's anything wrong with that, of course, or that combine a variety of approaches for pedagogical purposes, let's say. What I've tried to do is to focus, that's the clues in the title, specifically on polyphony, not even Renaissance music, but polyphony in itself. And there's reasons for that. One of them is that I really didn't want to speak so much about other types of musical activity. I really just wanted to focus on polyphony. The other thing is that I really wanted to, the idea behind it was to allow listeners, it's about listening to music. It's about what one can meaningfully perceive when one's listening to a piece of the Renaissance. The fact is we're used to the idea of connoisseurship, if we can use that term, when it comes to the classical period, or any period in common practice, if you like, and contemporary music and so on. But somehow in the Renaissance, it's perhaps not so easy to tell your Palestrina from your Lassus, or to tell your Dufay from your Ockeghem or whatever. And so what I've tried to do is to set out what you need to know in order to hear better or in a more informed way. And so all the chapters of the book relate to that in one way or another. There are chapters where you go behind the notes, I would say, just because it's interesting to do that for any period. And in the Renaissance, there are very particular reasons why you would want to do that. And also, I think finally, the last thing that I've tried to do is to be as up to date as I'm able to be about the sorts of debates and new discoveries that have been that I've been involved in or that I've known about. So, for example, there is a section about improvised polyphony. It's not very long, but it just has the essentials. It needed to be there because I think many other books of that sort don't so much talk about it. And it needed to be there because once you understand that composers did this, that a lot of the music that's written down could equally have been improvised, then it does make you listen to the music differently.
That leads us quite nicely into my next question, actually, which was, obviously you talked a little bit about the music extemporization in your talk just there, but I'm struck by the extent to which polyphony could be extemporized. And at the other end of the scale, you talk a lot in the book about notational riddles and the challenges that those presented to performers. And obviously the notation can be incredibly complex and full of these riddles that you talk about at some length. So although you've already talked a little bit about what that necessitated of performers, I wondered if you could just say a little bit more about what was so special then about performers of polyphony in the Renaissance.
Well, they're very specialized, as I said. They're trained they're trained in polyphony from a very, very young age indeed. That means that they understand that they've internalized the rules of counterpoint, all those things that we spend so much time teaching students to do. They have this from a very young age. They also are familiar with the notation too. So they understand this wonderful system that is measural notation, which is inherently quite complex, but also very efficient in the way it deals with, in the way that it sets the music out, and the way that it enables composers actually to explore itself, the actual notation. It lends itself to exploration on the part of composers. So they're a very specialized lot, and that was another reason to focus specifically on them.
And an extension of that, you talk quite a lot about the humour used in this music, and I wondered if you could say a little bit about how humour figures in the transaction between composer and performer, or indeed composer and listener.
It certainly figures in the transaction between composer and performer, because the composers are writing their music for an ensemble with whom, very often, with whom they will be working every day. I'm attracted to the idea of the musical humor anyway, because I suppose that's how I'm wired. So I'm perhaps quite sensitive to these things. But when we can talk about games, it's not often that there's sort of ha-ha humor. It's not things that make you laugh out loud, though there are some things that can. Yes. Yeah. Some things. I'm sorry, that's scrambled my mind. That has. Yes. There are situations that are not necessarily humorous, but that involve, I mean, it's the German term Witz, just wit, esprit, cleverness. So, for example, I mean, the canons are the most obvious example of that. You have this idea that you're notating something in a way that involves decoding by the performers. The performers have got to decode what you've written. They've got to read the music that's written down, but they've got to apply certain processes to it, which you indicate. But very often the way that you indicate those instructions is going to be set out in a riddle form, which then you also have to decode. So it's a bit like the best, I think it's Katalina Schultz who first observed this. This is rather like a cryptic crossword. When you're writing or setting or solving a Christmas cryptic crossword, you have certain words that you know are going to be triggers or signals that you've got, that you're dealing with an anagram or whatever it might be, and so it's very much like that. There's also humor to do with style, I think, because you have certain composers who are very interested in taking the lingua franca, the style of the period, and taking it in weird directions. And you imagine that when it's very easy to imagine when you actually perform the music yourself, that if you're reading this from the original notation, you see the composer setting up situations which are then diffused, or where you know that the performer is literally the target of the joke. And somehow the performer is going to think, oh yes, I'm coming up to a cadence. And then based on what the other voices are doing, has the rug pulled out from under it. So this idea of humor happens quite a lot. And so there's a whole section actually of the book. There's a chapter which is called Canons, Puzzles and Games, which talks about that sort of thing. But I think it is music that can be inherently humorous. And that's maybe also an aspect that is not always so perceptible to a modern audience. And that's why I think it's important that they're aware that these things are going on.
So we often speak of seminal musical works today, but as you said really in your talk, that such a work concept didn't exist in the Renaissance. And that's led some 20th century commentators to argue that this music is pre-aesthetic or made by craftsmen to serve a function, and that the purpose of the music is fulfilling that function. On reading the book and having performed some of this music, that seems at odds with reality to me. So I wondered if you could say something about the music fulfilling a function and the composers being craftsmen, according to a 20th century sort of theoretical vantage point.
Sure. Well, Yes, I suppose that's another one of the things that I had in my mind in a lot in a lot that is in this book. I think that part of the problem with the craftsman idea, the idea that as long as composers were working to satisfy the needs and demands of a patron or of the church, a liturgy, or a secular patron, that they don't have autonomy in what they're doing in their work, and that's a notion that has always enraged me, simply because the music tells you otherwise. It's very clear that these are people who have a critical awareness of what their music can do, and who are and who are often very interested, as I just explained or suggested. They're very often interested in investigating where the musical style, where the musical notation can go. So the idea that these people are critically unaware and just kind of, well, how shall I say? Well, just artisans, so to speak. And I think, incidentally, that you could say from a craftsman's point of view, that's actually quite insulting for craftsmen anyway. And that's important to get in as well. I think that it does a great disservice to the music, and I think it's part of the reason why Renaissance music is not perhaps as widely appreciated as it deserves to be, simply because of a certain cultural bias, which in this book I fight very hard to redress.
And kind of carrying on with that idea, I mean, many modern analytical methodologies privilege pitch and harmony and sometimes rhythm and syntax. But you draw attention to the importance of texture in the listening experience quite a lot throughout this book, and the role of notation in shaping oral, as in AURAL, oral experience. Can you say a bit more about that for anyone who might be new to this repertory, how important texture is?
Yeah, sure. I think that you're right, that a lot of the time analytical discourses focus on aspects of form, of pitch, of rhythm, of certain parameters. I think that texture is a compositional resource that gets used. Well, that's how should I say, that is absolutely fundamental to the way that Renaissance music functions. So much so that one of my chapters deals specifically with the interaction of texture and scoring, and how you can, in a sense, read the period that I cover, which begins from about 1450 and goes up to about 1600. You could read that entire period. Again, in terms of privileging the listening experience, you can read that entire, or hear that entire period as the interplay or the changing way in which texture and chordal spacing, well, how should I say, no, texture and scoring, which is to say how the different voices relate to each other in terms of their register and in terms of their function. You can really hear Renaissance music from start to finish as being an interplay of the different ways in which you articulate texture. So I'm thinking of antiphony, quite simply. Antiphony is one. The exchange of voices, of different groups of voices. Polyphony, which is just the generalized idea of independent part writing, and homophony. And really, when you've got those three parameters, those three texture types, you're off and running. And you can read the entire Renaissance, it seems to me, in terms of the different ways in which those three basic textual functions are allocated over the course of the period.
Lois, do you mind if I jump in here?
No, please do.
It's to take up on on one of those ideas of, and it's from Gordon's question, and I'd like to add a little bit onto it, saying, do you explore music education in this era? And that Gordon is struck by how virtuosic musicians must have been in order to improvise polyphony. And I'd like to sort of swing that back round to modern day teaching of harmony and counterpoint in a conservatoire context, and whether there is space for that sort of improvisation that people and how those two things maybe can sit together.
Well, certainly, I think there is space for it, or there can be space for it. It would be good if there were. Do I say much about pedagogy as such? I mention it. To be honest, I don't say too much about it because there have been quite a few studies, collections of articles predominantly, which deal with the specific question of how musicians were trained in the Middle Ages and Renaissance. We do know quite a bit about that, and so I've mostly referred the reader to those studies. But yes, this, I suppose if you're looking at it historically, the analogy for a slightly later period is these partimenti that you find for the Baroque period into the classical period. We know that this is how Mozart was trained, and Haydn and these composers. That is to say that you had a set number of formulae. Well, I mean, there were many of them, but there were different ways of getting around the notes, getting around the chords. And you learned them, you assimilated them, and this is what allowed you to improvise. So that's not a million miles away from what Renaissance composers. In fact, it's very close. The only difference is the style under which it's being done. But it's this idea that when you improvise, you are applying certain learned. I don't like the word formula because it makes it sound mechanical. These are things that you've internalized, but then you invent spontaneously on the basis of them in real time. And that invention, when you're very good, in fact, theorists say, because several of them say that actually the best improvisers are the ones who compose all the time. The composers make the best improvisers. And so we can really imagine that these mechanical formulae, so to speak, get turned into some really quite accomplished music. And in fact, in one specific case, which Philippe Canguilhem devoted, I think, most of an article to, there was a time in Toledo in about 1604 where the cathedral was looking for a chapel master, and the stuff that they got their candidates to do was absolutely hair-raising. I mean, you had to basically you had to invent a canon on the spot, and by using your hand, the Guidonian hand, which is a form of hand signaling, you invented the canon, you had other singers follow it after you, and then through a hand system, you signed another singer to sing a free voice, which you would invent at the same time. If you had in front of you a choir book with 4 voices, you were required to add a 5th part. Or if you had one of 3 voices, you were required to add a 4th, whatever. You added an additional part to one that was already. The amount of stuff they did was extraordinary. And when we think about it, it really, you wonder how on earth did they manage to do it? But again, it's a question of pedagogy. If you do this day in, day out, you can do these things.
And to pick up on that, but that sounds like the world's most difficult Kodály musicianship exam. But the question that I'd like to pick up on is about being immersed in this world and having that training in that ear. And this comes from Lucy, who says, was Renaissance polyphony accessible to commoners? She's thinking about the worldwide accessibility of composers' work on the internet these days, despite lockdown. And people say that music isn't becoming more accessible because of some of the things to do with lockdown. How do you come to terms with those things?
Well, I'd struggle. I think I'd struggle to say very much about the current situation because it's kind of hair-raising in itself. But as to what happens in the Renaissance, certainly the invention of printing in 1501 is a game changer. And from that moment, you plainly see that the publishers are aware that there is a market. People will buy music. People will buy, commoners, as you put it, will buy volumes of sacred music by composers. They will buy books of masses by composers. There is an audience for this music. Now that's down to social factors. You have a growing middle class with disposable income and leisure time to perform music. We have conversation books that survive, which, for example, tell of a family with a guest having had their dinner, and they do, okay, well, what do we do now? Well, let's get out the polyphony books and let's do a bit of singing. And then they argue about who, okay, who should take the descantus part, who should take the tenor, and that sort of thing. So there is a growing sense which first takes hold in the Renaissance. Actually, you don't see it really before then. The polyphony becomes, if you like, a commodity. Another way of saying it is that it is something that indeed the mom and dad at home can know about polyphony. The man on the street, the woman on the street knows all about it. We also know actually that there were plenty of people, including women, who performed, young women, typically, who did perform music. If they were commoners, it was easier for them to do this than if they were highborn, because of course, well, that is to say that they could do it commercially. Whereas, of course, if you were highborn, you couldn't do things that were deemed menial. And so, although women from a certain class of society were trained and were often very proficient in music, those of the lower class were actually able to perform as well, and might have continued to perform later on into adulthood as well. There's a hidden, it's a bit of an iceberg. We've got a few indications of that going on, but we do know that it did happen.
The parallels between that and now people getting onto CPDL and other open source things and doing exactly that in their parlors. In non-COVID times, there is an RCS Madrigal Club that get together and do that sort of thing. So, it comes full circle. We've got 3 minutes left, and good as my word, one question has been upvoted quite a lot, so I would like to pose it to you if you wouldn't mind. This is from Mieko, who it's lovely to see you again. It says, "Hi Fabrice, may I ask about the role of resonance in this repertoire? I ask this question because music making online does not allow for this mixing of sounds synchronously. For professional musicians today, how to handle resonance in a socially distant setup." I think what is an interesting question about that is the link between music as science and music in just intonation and the equal ratios and the architecture in which this music was meant to be performed, and that sort of special relationship as well.
Resonance. Well, the most immediate context in which I can think of resonance is, and I don't know, I'll try and be brief about this, so in case I don't really answer Mieko's question, she can tell me so. But there is one of the things that we associate automatically with Renaissance polyphony, it seems to me, is the manner of its performance in what tend to be what we call churchy acoustics. That is to say, very resonant acoustics. And one of the curious things is that, as far as we can tell, there would have been many situations in which actually polyphony was not performed in the nave of a church, where you've got, the business end of the resonance. And today, of course, it's performed there because you get the most people in seats. You get bums on seats if you're in church in the nave. Actually, polyphony was often performed in side chapels, which and sometimes simultaneously you might have had several. Well, you routinely had several masses being sung in the different side chapels, some of which may or may not have had polyphony. if you imagine several side chapels being used for polyphony, for commemorative services or whatever it might be, that's already something. But within those side chapels, you would have had much less resonance. And so this phenomenon of the churchy sound would not have obtruded so much. Then again, we also know, you can see this from Philip the Good, the illustration of Philip the Good hearing Mass. He's surrounded by tapestry, and there would have been a lot of tapestries. Even in these side chapels, you might have had them as well. So there would have been plenty, in other words, plenty of means to damp down a resonant acoustic, and we can reasonably infer from that that was not the sound in which they imagined necessarily their music was going to be heard. What that does is, go on, sorry.
Sorry, I'm just really conscious of the time, and we could go on for hours at this, but I feel that perhaps that would use more bandwidth than we were perhaps hoping for. The other thing to say about that, if I may, is when you see those photos of people, of the singers crowded around together, singing essentially into everybody's cassocks, and the sensation of that as a performer will be very different today when you look at somebody like Sten Turnstrom's talk of self to other ratio and how singers perceive their sound in relation to others. We generally prefer a spacing of about 1.5 meters. I'm just trying to sort of round off a little part of that question from Mieko. And that singers prefer that, actually. And it's been shown that that's how singers will like to stand if you give them the option. So perhaps we were the original socially distanced ensembles.
It's fascinating though, James, because you look at some of the pictures as well, and you see the facial expressions of the singers. They look like they're really straining or gurning or whatever, and it brings home that we don't really know what this stuff sounded like at the time. And that comes across very clearly, I think, in what work you've done. And I think that's the other thing, is that, we don't know the production of sound as much as the sound itself just could have been completely different from what we've ever known.
Absolutely. And that seems like a lovely place to round this talk off. I could not recommend Fabrice's book, Renaissance Polyphony, more highly to you. It's available from all good booksellers and Amazon. As I found out, as I primed it over the weekend in order to get at least a bit of it under my belt. And I must say that it is an extremely accessibly written account of what it's of, and very well thought out account of what is such a rich and complex topic. So I do commend it to you. I would also just like to say thank you very much for your talk and for being so accommodating in changing your topic to something that is relevant. I'm sorry, Alison and David, that we didn't quite get round to your comments. And all that's left to do is to say thank you to the Research and Knowledge Exchange team. Thank you to the events staff who have been facilitating this behind the scenes. You can follow us on Twitter at RCS_the exchange, and there will be a full list of exchange talks put into the chat. Next week, if you would like to join us again, it'll be Dr. Stuart McRae and Paul Carey-Jones talking about To the Last Syllable, a collaborative approach to word setting. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, Fabrice and Lois and Lily, for the cameos. And we'll see you and hopefully see you all next week. And so you can see that the link to the other talks is just in the chat now. So I'll let you click on that, say thank you very much, and then I'll end this call for us all.